in a bloody civil war against leftist rebels. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. And you know the cell phone thing where you silence your cell phones? This would be the time. Oh, well, losing your cell phone is just as good as silencing it. This Thursday we have a special event because this is National Library Week. Our staff is going to put on a show, and our first ever OCPL talent show. We have singers, we have short films, and live performance, crafters, and visual artists. So do not miss, that's noon Thursday. And next Tuesday, Zachary Brott, this is April 28th, he is the University Archivist and Records Manager for the University of Pittsburgh Library System. And his book is called From the Steel City to the White City, Western Pennsylvania and the World's Columbian Exposition. So it's the World's Fair in Chicago, the famous one, and its influence on Pittsburgh, or Pittsburgh's impact on it, and its influence on Western Pennsylvania. There is a new People's University coming in late June and into summer about America 250 and the Revolutionary War and the Constitution and all that good stuff we're celebrating. And the brochures are on your table. So I'll be putting that out more in the coming weeks. Now, here to introduce our guest today is our dear friend and the poet laureate of our great state, Mr. Mark Harshman.
Good afternoon. What a treat to have Scott Wallace with us here. It's in my book, he's a real celebrity. Maybe Scott doesn't see himself that way, but I do. It's a real treat. I think I'll do his bio last, and I won't do too much anecdotal story, except that Scott and Cheryl and I, our paths crossed at Little Bethany College like 50 years ago or more, and then would reconnect very briefly at Yale, and no visual sighting since, but it's until just the other day. So we're so glad to have him here. He's a marvelous storyteller. Just over the table last night, we were hearing stories about meeting Paul Kantner in Managua. You may remember Jefferson Airplane. About flying an old Lockheed, what is that called?
De Havilland Otter.
De Havilland Otter into a river in northern Quebec with the Cree indigenous people there and on. It is, as I say, a real treat to have him here. Scott is an award-winning writer and photographer who covers armed conflict, the environment, and vanishing cultures in volatile frontier regions around the world. Formerly a correspondent in Latin America for CBS News, Newsweek, and The Guardian, he is the author of the award-winning photographic and narrative memoir, Central America in the Crosshairs of War, On the Road from Vietnam to Iraq, and the New York Times bestseller, The Unconquered, In Search of the Amazon's Last Uncontacted Tribes, based on his firsthand experiences trekking through the land of an uncontacted indigenous people deep in the Brazilian jungle. His written work has appeared in National Geographic Adventure, the New York Times, Washington Post, Harper's, Smithsonian, and I don't have to tell you, those are all the major magazines in the United States. His photography is represented by Getty Images, has been published in newspapers and magazines throughout the world, and he is currently an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut, a graduate of Yale and the University of Missouri School of Journalism. About the book which Scott's going to most discuss today Central America and the Crosshairs. It's really several books at once that cohere into a magnificent whole. It is the evocative, at times nostalgic. It is the evocative, at times nostalgic, and at others harrowing personal account of a young journalist's coming of age during his first foreign journalism assignment. Always keenly observant and thoughtful, from Revista, the Harvard Review of Latin America. Please give a warm welcome to Scott Wallace.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a lovely introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm trying to get a visual back on the screen. Anyway, I'm really delighted to be back here in West Virginia. As Mark mentioned, I don't know if I think I'm good. Don't need this. Anyway, I'm delighted to be back here as I began, touch the screen? Oop. Hold on one sec. Sorry about that. But anyway, while we sort of sort out the technical stuff, I came here for the first time in 1973. This area is very dear to my heart. I came here for the first time during my freshman year of college to visit a second cousin who was teaching at Bethany College, meeting her and her husband, who were both teaching at Bethany. That's how I met Mark and his wife Cheryl. They were students at Bethany at the time. And through my second cousin, Tina Leyden-Jones, and David Leyden, I met a whole host of fascinating and extraordinary people, including Mark and Cheryl. The Gorby family, who lived just out of town in Bethany across the creek. And I'm sorry to say this, but Bill Gorby, who's an amazing musician, formerly played with the orchestra, and has been on Wheeling Jamboree and plays all across the country. And he had an incredible bluegrass band at the time when I met the Gorby family. So anyway, thank you for being here, everyone. And as I said, I'm really delighted to be back here. And do you need me to touch the screen? All right, sorry. Maybe I need to. Sure. Did a cord get yanked or something? Yeah. But thanks to all of you for coming out. And it's an honor for me to be here. And I want to thank Sean Duffy and all the staff here at the Ohio County Public Library as well for this invitation, and to Mark and Cheryl. Mark was instrumental in orchestrating, if that's the right word, this invitation. So thank you. So while we're waiting for this to get fixed, I'll just mention, in the 70s, I spent a good bit of time here in West Virginia, but eventually I decided to become a journalist and go to Latin America. At the time, the late 1970s, the Sandinistas had just overthrown a 50-year-old dictatorship, pro-U.S. dictatorship in Nicaragua, and a civil war had begun in El Salvador. And, all right, so maybe we've got, yeah, we got it? All right, so I'm getting rid of that. Hold on a sec. Yeah, so I don't know what happened to the, okay. So before I launch into my into a discussion about, so I'm going to be focused on that part of my life, the Central America part, in today's talk. And before we get started, it just occurred to me belatedly that maybe this would be a good way to sort of intro the whole thing. So I'm going to run this first. El Salvador, 1983. The U.S.-backed government is locked in a bloody civil war against leftist rebels. The Cold War is still on, and the U.S. fears the Soviet Union is trying to establish a communist beachhead in the hemisphere. I arrived straight from journalism school with press credentials from CBS News, which provide a kind of passport into the heart of the conflict.
A tense atmosphere reigns in San Salvador, where right-wing death squads have re-emerged to threaten and kidnap labor, religious, and university leaders.
The U.S. is pouring millions of dollars in aid into El Salvador to reform the government and vanquish the guerrillas. But human rights abuses persist. Death squads ply the nighttime streets, abducting and killing suspected opponents of the regime.
12 members of the local civil defense force were executed, some yanked from their homes unarmed. An entire family perished when the rebels bombed their house.
I soon realized the story that interests me the most is out in the countryside. That's where U.S. advisors are training recruits in Vietnam-style counterinsurgency warfare. It's where the rebels are on the move, devising new tactics of their own. And most importantly, it's where the untold stories of human drama are unfolding.
Her name is Rosa Miriam Quijada from the northern province of Chalatenango. She became a widow this week in a cruel tale reporters covering the war here have come to regard as routine.
More experienced reporters take me to the field and show me the ropes. I learn where I'm likely to find the guerrillas, where the army may be operating, and how to coax information from frightened civilians caught in the crosshairs.
Scott Wallace for CBS News, San Salvador.
The Cold War lens blurred the vision of those who looked through it, and it tended to obscure a deeper truth. Cold-blooded killing was taking place on a large scale. Entire communities were being ripped apart by the violence. I came to realize that we reporters were serving as valuable conduits. The people wanted the outside world to know. They wanted their stories to be told.
There's fear everywhere, said one. We're scared to death. We've been through too much to go back.
Eventually, I moved to Nicaragua, where again the U.S. was fighting a war by proxy. Here, the U.S. was arming and directing the Contra rebels, seeking to overthrow the revolutionary Sandinista government backed by Moscow.
Specially trained battalions sweep through the mountains. They encircle the rebels, then hammer them with mortar and machine gun fire.
It was harder to find the war in Nicaragua. It was taking place deep in the interior, where the Contras were staging deadly ambushes on military and civilian targets. As in El Salvador and neighboring Guatemala, the human toll was staggering for a country of this size. Tens of thousands dead or injured, hundreds of thousands more displaced by the violence.
According to witnesses, several hundred rebels moved into the hills surrounding the hamlet late Monday afternoon.
The people of Central America today are still living with the consequences of those wars. I think we owe it to ourselves and to our Central American neighbors to remember what happened there just a few decades ago. It's really the only way to understand the current immigration crisis on our southern border. And by remembering, perhaps we can also avoid such tragedies altogether in the future. Doesn't seem very likely, but yeah. So that was a piece we put together a few years ago, and I thought it might be interesting to share. Before we get started, so anyway, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. And I wanted to start with my, yeah, okay. All right, here we go. Could we go to a full screen? Enter full screen. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So you have now a little bit of background from the film I just showed. But where to begin now? It seems so, things are happening so quickly now with what's going on in Iran, immigration, ICE, all these things, and it's tempting to just kind of fixate on the current headlines today. The cost of living, the war in Iran, the price of oil. But I'd like to take a step back. As the saying goes, those who do not remember the past are bound to repeat it. So I'd like to take us back to a time in the 1980s to have a look at U.S. policy during that decade, and especially the policies of the administration of President Ronald Reagan. It seems almost quaint compared to what's going on in the Middle East today, in Gaza, West Bank, Straits of Hormuz. But from the start of his presidency, Ronald Reagan presided over a rapid escalation of U.S. military engagement in El Salvador. Also a secret and largely illegal war against the Nicaraguan government, the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, the Iran-Contra scandal, and the broader militarization that ravaged the social fabric of Central America and left the region by the end of the decade awash in guns and with its social fabric severely stressed. It was also a time when the 1980s, when U.S. policymakers were, and the nation as a whole, I guess, were still reeling from our defeat in Vietnam and the Watergate scandal. And when the Reagan camp came to power in early '81, they sought to once again advance what I would call an imperial agenda and reclaim executive power usurped, in their view, by Congress during the 1970s. A key component of this approach was to reinvigorate a Cold War vision of black versus white, us versus them, good versus evil. This ideological approach has had lasting consequences that continue to reverberate today in the United States, Central America, and I'd argue in the Middle East and throughout the world in the quarter century since the Cold War has come to an end. So I'd like to revisit this period and to reflect on the events I witnessed firsthand as a journalist and photographer based in Central America for most of that decade, and to look at the lasting impact on those policies today. Except for a few images where I appear in the coming slides, all of these images are also in the book, which I have brought with me for anyone who might like to purchase a copy and have me sign it after the talk. So it may be difficult to believe, but 40 some odd years ago, tiny El Salvador was the third largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid after Egypt and Israel. And that was because the Reagan administration believed that a largely homegrown guerrilla movement posed a national security threat to the United States. At the time, as I said in the introduction before, you'll recall the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a global power struggle known as the Cold War. And the Cold Warriors in the Reagan camp believed that any challenge to what was really a putrid social structure, the status quo of a putrid social, economic, and political system in these various Central American countries, believed that the challenge to that status quo was being orchestrated by the hidden hand of Moscow. To counter this perceived threat, the U.S. under President Reagan began to pump massive amounts of military aid into El Salvador. By the end of the decade, El Salvador would become the most prolonged and expensive U.S. military endeavor between the Vietnam War and the Persian Gulf conflicts. It was in the midst of that engagement that I appeared in El Salvador in June 1983, a freshly minted graduate from journalism school. I won't go into the story here about how that happened, but it was pretty crazy, but I was able to get credentialed from CBS and get authorization to use their bureau in San Salvador within a month after graduating from journalism school. From the get-go, I experienced a jarring disconnect between official pronouncements emanating from Washington and from the U.S. Embassy and what I was seeing with my own eyes and ears. I started out making rounds, the daily rounds as a journalist, to the press conferences, the embassy briefings, the homilies at the Metropolitan Cathedral. I found the entire atmosphere in San Salvador was infused with a sense of menace and intrigue. Paramilitaries were plying the streets. They were rounding up people in the dead of night, going about in trucks without license plates, wearing masks. Don't know if that sounds familiar. Anyway, and taking people away. And these forces were linked to the military, and they were being supplied. Effectively, our tax dollars were paying for this. Their bodies would turn up days later, bearing gruesome signs that they'd been interrogated under duress, to put it mildly. There were radio announcements that urged people to call a denounce a subversive hotline. And you can imagine how that would work. Anyone who had a problem with his neighbor might be tempted to get on the phone. There was plenty of talk from U.S. officials about that democracy was taking root, and that the government was caught between extremes of right and left, and that the human rights situation was improving. But in fact, the extreme right was an integral part of the government that we were supporting, not some out-of-control renegade faction, as our officials maintained. At the same time, the of implementing democratic reforms flew in the face of a grim reality. The death squads and security forces had already liquidated much of the political spectrum, especially the center and the Democratic left, and had driven basically the rest either underground or out into the mountains, the countryside. Thousands had been killed or disappeared, and no one had been brought to justice. The administration claimed to be championing democracy to the extent that it pushed to hold elections in El Salvador, and that was important. But it was, championing democracy, kind of a quaint notion today, in fact. But the U.S. officials from the president on down insisted that the rebels give up their weapons as a condition for joining the electoral process, even though there were no guarantees for their security as a condition for joining the process. And so they knew it was a non-starter with the rebels. So it wasn't really a negotiation. In short, they were pushing a half-truth and a truncated version of democracy. The death squads even reached into the highest levels of the Salvadoran government that we were supporting. Here in this photo, this is Roberto Dabuison on the right, who was known chief of the death squads and president of the National Assembly of El Salvador. I took this picture shortly after arriving in El Salvador at the National Assembly, where it would later be revealed Dabuison had his chief of security at the assembly was operating a hit squad out of the National Assembly, and that same guy had gotten his start in those dark arts by confederating a Boy Scout troop from his native Usulután out in eastern San Salvador into a death squad. Impunity reigned. No one was being brought to trial. No one was being held to account. It was an unsettling time to be a journalist in El Salvador. The far-right military viewed us journalists with deep suspicion. Shortly after I arrived, a death squad called the Secret Anti-Communist Army took out a full-page ad in the newspapers saying that American reporters were agents more dangerous and sympathetic to the terrorists than anyone in Moscow. The defense minister, seen here on the right, Carlos Eugenio Vides Casanova, told his troops that American public opinion was one of the war's major fronts, as important as San Vicente or Morazan. By the way, so the Minister of Defense later implicated in the murders of 3 American churchwomen in El Salvador and expelled from the United States a couple of years ago, where he was living in Florida in a cushy retirement, and justice finally caught up with him and deported him back to El Salvador. So, as I said, President Reagan, and so us journalists, we journalists straddled this kind of line between the shooting war and the information war back home. Even so, we enjoyed a certain level of protection being Americans and being journalists that most ordinary Salvadorans did not enjoy. And as I said, President Reagan claimed that a national security threat was at issue here, but he also was boxed in by memories of Vietnam. And so he had to cajole Congress into funding the war. He assured the public we wouldn't get dragged into an open-ended conflict against an elusive guerrilla foe. Instead, we would use proxy forces, and there would be U.S. advisors there, but we would not be in a combat role there. It was one of the war's ironies. On the one hand, the guerrillas were seen as supposed to be a national security threat, but it wasn't enough of one to put our own troops in harm's way. The Pentagon dispatched Special Forces advisors, Green Berets, but capped their number at 55 to assuage fears that we might be stumbling into a new Vietnam. In the summer of 1983, a team of Green Berets, all veterans of Vietnam, were in San Vicente province east of San Salvador, training the Salvadoran military in modern counterinsurgency warfare, small patrols, ambushes, aggressive search and destroy operations, and civic action, supervising development projects designed to win the hearts and minds of the Salvadoran peasantry in the countryside. So I went out to San Vicente and set up shop there. It was just, I was staying in a flea bag hotel just down the street from the garrison in San Vicente where the Special Forces advisors were billeted. And it was a great place to be because I got tremendous access to the U.S. military's, to the advising, the training, and what was going on in San Vicente, which was kind of the center of the war at that time. But like the president, the advisors themselves were also allergic to that notion of, they wanted, allergic to comparisons to Vietnam. And so when I asked one of my friends who was a Special Forces captain how he compared his experiences in Indochina to El Salvador, his experiences as an advisor, he bristled. He goes, "We don't call ourselves advisors. That conjures up ghosts." You might recall the first troops in Vietnam back in the early 60s were all Special Forces advisors, and then the war escalated from there. The remnants Oh, and here's another advisor glowering at me. They weren't supposed to be in a combat role, but I caught this guy. You notice he's got his face heavily painted with ear flaps on his hat covering his ears so you couldn't see his, Caucasian complexion. But he was in a place where he shouldn't be with a weapon that he was technically not supposed to have at the time. The conditions were the advisors were supposed to refrain from any combat activities. So San Vicente, as I said, the remnants of what had been largely started as an urban opposition, the ones that survived, the death squads and the security forces had fled to the countryside and joined the ranks with impoverished peasants to form the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. These guys were our putative enemy in El Salvador. And at the time, San Vicente was the strategic crossroads for the FMLN, who were moving troops and logistics back and forth from east to west and north to south. And the military decided to make San Vicente the testing ground for this campaign to roll back rebel gains. I was a freelance reporter or stringer for CBS News. I worked on so a stringer is someone who represents a news organization but is not formally a staffer, like a freelancer who provides steady content to news organizations. So I was a CBS stringer. And as I said, I'd grown tired of that oppressive atmosphere in San Salvador, which led me to get out to San Vicente and to get out to San Vicente. I found, I started following my radio stories for CBS from there. The paramilitary forces that had conducted a campaign of terror in the years leading up to the explosion of the Civil War had been banned the civil defense at U.S. urging, trying to create reforms and sort of clean up this human rights situation in El Salvador. But in 1983, the U.S. advisors they realized they actually needed the civil defense paramilitaries to hold down static targets like villages, bridges, power lines, to turn the counterinsurgency forces they were training loose on offensive operations into the countryside to neutralize the guerrillas' advantage in the countryside. So the civil defense, as I said, had been disbanded because of their brutal civil rights, human rights performance, and that the U.S. was. And here's an advisor who's actually technically not supposed to be talking to these guys, because this is supposed to fall under the rubric of police forces, not military. But anyway, here's this guy, Captain Jeff Nelson was his name, and from Minnesota. And I asked him that day, I said, aren't you concerned that you might be resurrecting a Frankenstein here, creating another civil defense force that's going to be preying on the local population as the previous force did? And his response to me was, well, first of all, these guys know that if they come under attack and the rebels take the town, the first thing they're going to do is execute them. So that's going to keep them in line. So I was thinking, so what he's saying is, in effect, that the guerrillas themselves are the main deterrent for human rights abuses in the countryside. So, that was the thing, is you'd get very frank discussions from people who were not, in the embassy in San Salvador or in Washington. So I really appreciated that kind of honesty. And it seemed to me like maybe, that the guerrillas, so as he said, guerrillas are going to be, shielding the population from abuses by the military. And it seemed to me and the paramilitaries, that maybe many Salvadorans felt that way. Like that's why they saw the guerrillas somehow as protectors, and maybe that was one of the reasons why the guerrillas showed so much resilience as the United States kept upping the ante and pouring more money, weapons, advisors into El Salvador. The guerrillas continued to show resilience and bounce back on the battlefield. So anyway, yeah, here's a rare occasion where someone involved in human rights abuses is actually like taken into custody. So I eventually was able to persuaded CBS to finance a car so I could move around the back roads, find fresh stories for myself and the visiting television correspondents who were parachuting in from New York or Los Angeles. And now I had the mobility that allowed me to cover all sides of the war, the guerrillas, the army, the US advisors, and the civilians caught in the middle. It was slow going in those cars up these secondary roads, just that had been abandoned for years. Boulders, potholes, and some of the roads were mined too, so you had to be careful like what you were doing out there. And crossing the no man's land, so it was actually possible, it was quite amazing, it was actually possible to like cross over army government controlled lines and then out into this no man's land to look for the guerrillas. And so that was one of the main sort of ways you would, to cover the war, was to traverse these no man's lands to get to what were essentially villages that had fallen either under the sway of the guerrillas or were up for grabs, and nobody was like held permanent control there. And so when you went into these villages, you never knew who was going to be there. It was always prudent to stop and ask questions of peasants who were by the side of the road along the way. Is it safe up ahead? Is it mined? I remember one time I asked the peasant, I was driving alone out in the countryside, and I said, is it safe up there? And he just said, "Ay, silencio." It's quiet, but in this ominous way, like maybe there's an ambush up ahead. So I just turned my car around and went back. Those roads, as I said, often led to these kind of twilight zone towns where you're never sure who was there. This village, this hamlet in particular, Tenancingo, was a place I would come back to again and again. You'd find these hamlets where, one day, so Tenancingo, one day the army was there. We'd come back maybe a couple weeks later and find the rebels there. And sometimes all you'd find is like, kind of a few dazed villagers who had mastered the fine art of providing food and information to both sides, but without arousing the undue suspicions of either. These places had long since ceased to function in any meaningful way. There was no electricity, no commerce going on, and vehicular traffic had shrunk, had dried up to almost nothing. So when a car came into town, everyone knew that you were coming because almost no one ever went up there anymore. Pardon me? Here? All right. So this picture actually is. These are trying to residents are trying to rebuild their war-ravaged village. This is a place called San Lorenzo, and as part of the Civic Action Hearts and Minds program that the U.S. was trying to initiate, they were being paid by USAID $1 a day to rebuild their, to try to like repave their roads, rebuild their houses. Yeah. So it was in this manner that I experienced the countryside in El Salvador. As I said, sometimes I would go with I started out going with more experienced photographers and reporters, and And around this time, I also started writing for the Atlanta newspapers. So I was working for CBS on the broadcast side and writing for the Atlanta papers and taking pictures that accompanied my stories in the Atlanta papers. As a freelancer, with my own schedule, I was free from a lot of the demands that other journalists had to report on the press conferences and the daily events in the capital, because El Salvador was a pretty big story back then. You might remember it was, and but I had, now that I had my own car and the confluence of events, what was going on allowed me to get out in the countryside more. It gave me a great bit of latitude, and every time it seemed like every road led me to a new surprise as I was like getting acquainted with the deep countryside in El Salvador. You'd come around a turn and suddenly there'd be a group of guerrillas there. I developed during this time an ear for when someone was telling the truth or someone was telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. I gained a sense, as I said, for when it was safe to venture up one road, when an ambush might be in wait down another. And these surprises kept, these surprise encounters with the guerrillas kept repeating over and over again as I was driving through the countryside in 1983. Just about every back road seemed to lead to a guerrilla patrol of one time or another. But it wasn't even just back roads. Soon, I was traveling one day with a French reporter, and we were entering a pretty major city of like 50,000, and we found ourselves in following a caravan of pickup trucks with armed fighters in the back, and it was so like, who are these guys? It was so weird. It took a couple seconds to sort of settle in our minds. Oh my God, these guys are rebels, and they're taking over the city right now. So we were seeing like history unfold as it was happening, which was quite extraordinary. I was, of course, I was apprehensive about these encounters at first. As I said, after all, these guys were our putative enemy. Like, how are they responding? What's their attitude toward American journalists or Americans in general? Another irony of the war, the rebels seemed to have a better understanding of the relationship, of the role of a free press in a democracy. They understood what we were doing there. They understood that we were independent observers. And they also knew that it behooved them to treat us well because they could reach audiences back home with their message if they were, treating the journalists with respect and providing some kind of information that was in some way useful. Of course, U.S. officials sought to, and this was interesting, this was in one hamlet where I ran it. This is a Belgian-born priest, Rogelio Poncel was his name, who had made the decision after death squads raided his church in San Salvador and carried off a bunch of his parishioners, never to be seen again. He decided he was going to adopt a life on the run, preaching the gospel to the guerrilla army and accompanying them on their ventures across El Salvador. It was very rare to run into this guy. He probably had one of the highest prices on his head of anyone in El Salvador at the time, and he was in this hamlet that we ventured into one day. The U.S., sought to portray the guerrillas as dupes of Moscow, Havana, wholly dependent on the weapons that were coming supposedly from Nicaragua. And of course, the rebels told a different story. They said they were capturing their weapons from the same Salvadoran army that we were supplying. In effect, they said the U.S. was arming both sides of the war. And there was plenty of evidence to back up this claim. They were, by this time, raiding army garrisons, whole armories, capturing troops by the dozens and getting their weapons. And so there was some credibility to their claim, whereas the U.S. version of events insisted that there was this kind of like Ho Chi Minh pipeline supplying the rebels. It was an assertion that actually they never managed to prove. In fact, I was talking about how the advisors themselves would often, their off-the-record comments to me would contradict what was the official line, and the defense attaché of the United States from the Defense Intelligence Agency, one day I was touring the battlefield with him, and he said to me, I keep asking my Salvadoran colleagues to show me the proof about the Nicaragua pipeline or the weapons coming through. I keep asking them, show me the proof. And they've never shown me the proof. Anyway. So, and you'll notice in these, so this is the government army, the Salvadoran army. You'll notice these are M16s, or these are M16s, and almost all the weapons in the early years of the war on both sides were M16s. So the U.S. said the Salvadoran guerrillas were getting their weapons through Nicaragua, that they were M16s that had been left behind in Vietnam, and had eventually found their way through Hanoi, Tripoli, Havana, Managua to El Salvador. And there may have been, a few, that may have been one of the conduits for the weapons, but it was unquestionable that they were taking large amounts of the weapons from the U.S.-backed army. You'll remember that around this time, the administration chose to launch a secret war against Nicaragua, against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, to cut off that purported flow of arms from Nicaragua to the Salvadoran rebels. The Soviet Union was indeed supplying the Sandinistas. I mean, there's no secret about that. So there's a Soviet-made Mi-17 helicopter. I'm on a heliborne mission with the Sandinista Army. AK-47s, also from the Soviet Union. The Contras, though, who were being armed and trained by the United States in sanctuaries in Honduras, they did not have the wherewithal to maintain a permanent presence inside Nicaragua, except via airdrops, which were the sort of Achilles heel that eventually revealed the actual Iran-Contra scandal when a plane of Oliver North's network was shot down over Nicaragua. But in fact, but the Contras never interdicted any weapons going to the Salvadoran rebels. What they did do was launch a campaign of terror through the countryside in Nicaragua, targeted schools, clinics, farming cooperatives. They assassinated teachers, healthcare workers, anyone involved in advancing the social welfare programs of the Sandinista revolution. So unsavory were their tactics that Congress moved to cut off aid to the Contras, and that eventually set the stage for the Iran-Contra scandal, because the Reagan White House began to look for ways to circumvent that prohibition on aiding the Contras that Congress had put in place. So you can see back then, you had a Congress that was much more willing to flex its muscles than today's. That's another story, but. So if you'll remember, or the Iran-Contra, the link between Iran, obviously in the news today, Contras, was that Oliver North had devised the scheme with John Poindexter, who was the National Security Advisor, to sell arms to Iran illegally under the table at inflated prices, and use the proceeds from those sales to finance the Contras, also illegally under the radar. That's the essence of Iran-Contra. But unlike El Salvador, where the war was like everywhere, it was like, sometimes, your home in San Salvador was like the least safe place to be. So the war was in the city and the countryside, but in Nicaragua, the war was really contained to the remote countryside, and it took concerted effort to get there. And as the Contra War heated up in 1985, I moved my base of operations from El Salvador to Nicaragua. It would take several hours to reach the northern mountains or the central highlands of Nicaragua where the war was unfolding. Several hours even to get up into the mist-shrouded heights and these twisting, winding dirt roads that were littered with the burnt-out hulks of Toyota pickup trucks and other vehicles that the Contras had ambushed. The technicians who were working on the revolution projects, telephone workers, anyone, teachers, healthcare workers, actually took to arming themselves to defend against these Contra ambushes, but which had the effect of like blurring the line between who was a combatant, who was who qualified as a bona fide civilian, and who was a combatant. So there was that was a kind of nebulous area between combatant and civilian. We'd fly. I often traveled in the countryside with. So here's an instance where the Sandinista army is creating a free fire zone to battle the Contras. So here's a moment when, without warning, they showed up in a rural community where the Contras, it would be a mistake not to say that the Contras had no popular support. They did have, a certain level, definitely among the conservative peasantry. And so to try to undercut their support in the countryside, the Sandinistas started going in. This is like early 1985, and without warning, going into villages with a convoy of trucks and giving the peasants like half an hour to pull together their belongings, and they would move them out. To create free fire zones where they could then bring to bear like attack helicopters and artillery. Presumably anything that moved in there was, a legitimate target, which ironically is kind of a tactic that pioneered in Vietnam that the Sandinistas were now using in their counterinsurgency campaign against the rebels, the Contra rebels. So it was all very confusing, I'm sure, for people back here at the time. Well, we're supporting a guerrilla army in El Salvador, but we're trying to vanquish a guerrilla army and we're supporting a guerrilla army in Nicaragua and trying to vanquish one in El Salvador. And it made for a lot of, it was difficult for us journalists to try to explain that in a way that people would understand. But anyway, to get to the war in Nicaragua, as I said, it was like a monumental task at times. And we would, tape TV to the windshield of their car, fly big white flags to try to alert the Contras, or anyone else for that matter, that we were civilians, and please don't shoot. It didn't always work. But as I said, so to really see the fighting in Nicaragua, you could see the aftermath in the smoking, ambush, smoldering vehicles or farming cooperatives that were attacked. But to really see the war, you had to embed with one side or the other to get to and almost always to hook up with the Contras, you had to go to their base camps in Honduras and then into Nicaragua from Honduras with them. These are Contras in the base camp in Honduras, in Yamales, Honduras, being blessed before heading into Nicaragua on a mission. Joining the Sandinista army required earning the trust of the officials and convincing them you weren't a spy looking to uncover their operational secrets. I was on one mission where these images are from, and the political cadre of the battalion came up to me one day and he said, "So how do we know you aren't CIA?" And I'm like, just thinking off the top of my head, I just said to him, "Well, you don't, but it's more likely you'd be than me, because I'm too obvious, but you'd have a perfect cover." And he just like closed his mouth after that. One day we managed to bluff our way past a roadblock into the battle zone, the conflict zone in El Salvador. There was a Sandinista army roadblock. We gave them a letter that was outdated and giving us authorization to be somewhere else, but they took us, oh, okay, and they let us go. And a few hours further on, we encountered this huge convoy moving an entire battalion. There were like 40 trucks moving like 1,000 troops. And as we're like going along the line of these trucks, someone yells out, "Gentile!" Bill Gentile, who I was traveling with, they recognized this truck. He had been on an operation with the same battalion earlier. So we stopped and we started talking with the battalion commanders, and they said, "We're on our way to, on a mission. You want to join us?" So we said, "Sure." So we inserted Gentile's Jeep into the convoy. And from that moment on, the troops who were seeing this, they were like, "Who are those guys?" Seeing like the battalion commanders in the Jeep with us, as we're like traveling along. And so they started calling us the Sovieticos, the Soviets, because they figured we must have been Soviet advisors to get this kind of treatment from their commanders. So anyway, 2 nights later, there's Gentile in his Jeep. 2 nights later, and that was the day when, it was like part of the job description, basically, if you were a journalist, to smoke. There's no question. So 2 nights later, we joined this group of recruits and some very seasoned troops. And our battalion, the battalion we were traveling with, their advanced scouts discovered a Contra encampment on a bluff. And it was getting late in the day, and the Contras were up there, oblivious to our presence, making camp. They were so careless, they were even using their flashlights as they erected their tents. And so the troops we were with waited till dark. And then we were like maybe 400 yards in a straight shot. I'm over time. In a straight shot. And so we witnessed the Sandinistas just after dark launching this attack with rockets, machine gun fire, and blowing this Contra encampment up. I am sorry, I have a lot more to share with you. Maybe we can get to a few things in the Q&A. Do we have a few minutes for Q&A?
We could do like
two questions? Okay. Yeah, my apologies for yeah. I just turned it off, so I've turned it off before.
Yeah, I turned it off.
Not working? Wait, hold on for the microphone.
Check.
Okay.
We got it.
Question in the back.
Hold on one moment. The reason why we use the mic for questions is for the recording and for folks online.
That was excellent, and I think you should go for another hour. But anyway, I just,
Thank you.
and I had a couple of unrelated questions. But if the United States had not gotten involved, what might have? Can you have any thought of what might have been the outcome of
the alternative reality.
And anywhere down there.
So, I think that eventually, I think eventually things would have settled down, and there would have been, first of all, there would have been much less of that people would have had more incentive. If the United States had gone down there and we had taken that money and put it into, like construction, education, building schools, financing, social projects. First of all, I don't think that we would have had the immigration crisis to the extent that we've had since. And I think that eventually we would have seen a kind of moderate democratic socialism. That's what I think. Yeah, instead of what we have today, which is, so these countries have evolved into narco states in many instances, lots of gang violence. The weapons that we left behind became the instruments of, gangs and extortion. And so driving more people, the wars drove the first waves of Central Americans to the United States. And then a lot of those people were deported back to Central America in the 1990s, where they went back to implant gang culture in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, that drove a new wave of immigration here and continued to up until, pretty much last year. I think, so I don't know if I've really answered your question.
No, that's a great perspective, and I don't think any of us have thought or realized that what happened in the 1980s led to what we're dealing with today.
And one other thing, this also kind of gave birth to these clandestine operations like Iran-Contra, where, we were basically being lied to and kept in the dark about our government's policies, and that we can certainly see that that's continued.
And I'm sorry, just ask real quick, how do you survive? Drinking, incredible, you must have faced incredible risks and things like
there
that,
were a
but
few.
Just drinking the water and eating
There were
food.
a few. I tried to find, anyway, I'm lucky, I guess. I was lucky, yeah.
Okay, we will take one more question, but I do want to mention Mr. Wallace has 2 different books for sale. The small book is $25, and the larger book that he discussed today is $40. And you had a question?
Mr. Wallace, it seems like journalists today who are covering wars or trying to around the world have a different set of challenges. Do you have any observations you could share about that? Like, for instance, in Iran, I'm not sure American journalists can even get into the country.
Not right now, they can't, no. There have been, I think, a few foreign journalists have been allowed into Iran, mostly television reporters, mostly for, European or other media. But as far as, one thing I can say is it's become much more difficult and dangerous to cover armed conflict today than it was back in the 1980s. As I said, we enjoyed a certain level of protection, not afforded to the ordinary citizens of these countries, largely because there were, vertical chains of command, even among the rebels that kept their fighters in line, and they knew they'd have a imbroglio if their guys, killed journalists. It did happen, but not with the same kind of, frequency as today, where just being, a Westerner puts a target on your back in many places, and it's become much more dangerous.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions, unfortunately, but Mr. Wallace does have his books for sale up here. If you have other questions, I'm sure he'll be able to answer them at the book table.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.